Harmony of Dissonance was part of the trilogy of Castlevania games that landed on the Game Boy Advance and saw you taking up the fight as Juiced, the grandson of the legendary Simon Belmont, as you set out to rescue a childhood friend from the depths of Dracula's castle. Anyone who's played Symphony of the Night or Circle of the Moon will feel right at home, with the gameplay largely remaining untouched as you explore the castle, slowly revealing the huge map of the building and taking out enemies with your trusty whip. You also come across different weapons such as axes, holy water and daggers that make short work of each and every threat, but what helped spice up the action was the inclusion of something known as the fusion system. Any of those extra weapons you come across can be fused with a spellbook and unleash devastating magic attacks similar to the item crash ability of other games in the series. Each of them creates a unique spell with each different book equipped, so part of the fun is finding out what monsters are weaker to which element. When it comes to the visual makeup of the game, the one major complaint with Circle of the Moon was addressed, and Harmony of Dissonance is a much more brighter and colourful game as a result, with the character sprites being much larger and easier to see. Juiced himself animates very smoothly and is much more agile than the previous protagonist, and there's even some pretty neat 3D effects thrown in for good measure that take full advantage of the rotating and scaling effects the Game Boy Advance has to offer, such as doors opening and closing or clouds that come rolling towards you in the background. Overall, it's a much more visually pleasing adventure that's just as enjoyable to play today as it was when it released. Coming off the huge success of its home console release, Super Monkey Ball made its way to the GBA and surprisingly offered a pretty authentic take on the series. If you've never played any of the games, the main objective is to guide your monkey through a range of different levels by tilting the stage itself. However, it's not as easy as it sounds. First off, you've got a time limit in which you need to complete each course, and many of the stages have narrow platforms which make it hard to complete quickly, with one wrong move causing you to fall and having to start over again. Add to this the complete lack of an analog stick, with it being replaced by a simple 3-level digital response from the D-pad. Then there's the fact that many of the stages have some kind of obstacle that will further prevent you from reaching the goal. These obstacles may either be ramps, moving blocks, stairs, bumpers, or even the fact that you have to freefall at times. And when you put all of these factors together, it's no walk in the park. Now visually, Super Monkey Ball Jr. is extremely similar to its console counterparts. Of course, it's really dialed back in terms of fidelity, but the game's look and feel translates quite well to the GBA. The stages are composed of crisp 3D polygons that tilt and rotate as you navigate your monkey down the course. The monkeys themselves don't actually do much besides tumbling and spinning, so there's little real action to watch. However, the sheer scale and visibility of each maze is truly impressive, especially for a system with limited 3D capabilities. Now, some slowdown is evident in later, more complex levels, but the game still remains playable despite it. Super Monkey Ball Jr. managed to retain many aspects of the games fans have come to know and love, and it stands as one of the best looking titles the Game Boy Advance ever received. As part of the Link to the Past release on the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo went the extra mile and included a completely new mode for fans of the series to play. Known as Four Swords, it was a multiplayer experience that saw up to 4 players working together to overcome a series of different challenges throughout Hyrule, and the dynamic between cooperation and friendly competition were at the core of the adventure. As while you did have to work together to solve puzzles and defeat enemies as well as bosses, you've also got to try and collect the most amount of treasure, creating hilarious and chaotic moments throughout the game where it's possible to betray your friends and leave them behind to grab the best loot for yourself. One of its standout features is the sheer amount of different dungeons to work through that bring along different layouts, enemies and puzzles to solve, making each and every time you play feel like something completely new. Now, the Zelda series has always been known for its enchanting art direction and visual style, and Four Swords was no exception. When compared to A Link to the Past, Four Swords features brighter, more saturated colours that absolutely pop on the Game Boy Advance's screen, with the character sprites being much more in line with the Wind Waker and Minish Cap aesthetic, with plenty of animations for both combat and comedic expressions that exaggerate your actions throughout each run. Four Swords may not always get the recognition it deserves compared to the other Zelda games on the Game Boy Advance, but from a graphical standpoint, it is a true gem of the console's library that refines the classic Zelda look, enhances it with vivid colours and fluid animations, and introduced various technical effects that made the series' first multiplayer outing one to remember. Rayman 3 is quite possibly one of the best platformers you can find on the Game Boy Advance, and that's not only because of its visuals, but its wide variety of gameplay styles that completely steal the show and push the console to its limits. First off, you've got the standard platforming sections that see you going from A to B and taking out enemies and collecting items along the way, with up to 5 different power-ups that can be found throughout the many different levels, ranging from weapons that increase your strength or being able to jump for longer periods of time, which all have a role to play. Secondly, there's various moments you'll be using a barrel to fly, with the game essentially turning itself into a side-scrolling shooter. And finally, you've got one of many 3D levels where you use Sam the Snake to drag you across the ground while avoiding mines and bombs, as well as jumping over obstacles. Regardless of what stage or activity you're doing though, the graphics are a huge highlight throughout each of them. Rayman's sprite is highly detailed, and the same can be said for the enemies and bosses as well, which are all animated with all the fluidity you could hope for. Rayman swings, throws barrels, hangs from vines, and rides rockets that all look effortless in motion. But what really hits it home are the environments you'll be exploring, from swamps to caves, jungles, and fortresses that are all extremely vibrant and go hand in hand with the playful nature of the game. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a couple of 3D stages that take advantage of the Mode 7 style technique that use the GBA's rotation and scaling effects on a background layer with great results, and give each of these levels a really unique look. When it comes down to it, Rayman 3 is easily one of the most graphically impressive games that the Game Boy Advance ever received. The Game Boy Advance got its fair share of racing games. With the likes of Mario Kart and the GT series, you were never short of options when it came to looking for a new racer to jump into. When it comes to the most graphically impressive though, this is where Top Gear Rally screams into first place, and thankfully it's got the gameplay to match. Like many others of its kind, it's all split up into several different modes for the player to choose from, with the standard selection being present from Championship to Time Attack, Quick Race and Practice. The Championship is where you'll be spending most of your time, and it sees you travelling across the globe and taking on a series of races with over 30 different courses that deal out points depending on your final position. The controls do have a slight learning curve because the game so effectively depicts the slick and bouncy nature of rallying, with your car reacting to your inputs and the terrain quite realistically, so it'll take a while to get used to how each of them control, but once you've got the steering down, you'll soon be able to drift around corners in style. Graphically, Top Gear Rally is in a league of its own, and the game's tracks are put together using a combination of textured surfaces and sprite-based objects, and compared to other racing games on the system, the car models within the game are truly something else. Each one has somewhere between 200 polygons that make them up, with a range of different touches such as rotating tyres and reflective windows, and as you drive around each course, your tyres will kick up dirt, sand or snow depending on the surface you're currently on. All in all, the best way to describe it would be spectacular, and even though there were clearly a few shortcuts the developers had to take in order to get it running, especially when it comes to the game's AI, it was still an incredible feat. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and its sequel were absolutely huge games on the Dreamcast, PlayStation and N64, so it was a bit of a no-brainer that it would eventually end up on one of the various handheld platforms of its time, and even though the Game Boy Color version was disappointing, the Game Boy Advance would end up offering an experience that was surprisingly quite close to its console counterpart. If you've been living under a rock and have no idea what the series entails, it sees you selecting one of several pro skaters as you take on various objectives set across a variety of levels that range from high schools to urban streets and warehouses. By using a combination of the D-pad and face buttons, you can pull off one of the many different tricks, from kickflips to grabs and even specials that are unique to each character. The goal is essentially to string them together and earn a high score that contributes to one of the tasks that each level asks of you. But you'll also have to find hidden items and interact with the environment, such as having to knock over all of the fire hydrants in the NYC stage. But the biggest standout in Tony Hawk's 2 though are the graphics, with each of the skaters being represented by simple polygons that enable them to realistically and smoothly carry out animations much more effectively than sprites. They're not really that detailed, but they do get the job done, with the environments in each stage being handled by 2D rendered backdrops that take on an isometric view to give them some depth. Pulling all of this together is the sheer speed that the action plays out in, giving each and every run a quite authentic take on the world of skateboarding. Even though it released at the same time as the console itself, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 more than proved that the GBA was no slouch when it came to visuals. When it comes to first-person shooters, the Game Boy Advance wouldn't likely be your first choice, but there were several games that surprisingly made the move to the handheld console, from Doom to Duke Nukem, Wolfenstein, and of course Serious Sam. Now the game is broken up into a series of about 12 different levels, where it's your job to eliminate an ever-increasing amount of different enemies by utilising a range of inventive weaponry. You've got your standard choices like rocket launchers and pistols, but you've also got Sam's trademark chainsaw that all serve as a means to stand your ground throughout the several stages. Now control is admittedly quite rough, with your movement being handled through a combination of the D-pad and the shoulder buttons that do take a bit of time to get used to, with A firing your weapon, and by holding B it's possible to slow down your aiming, which really helps with picking your shots. Of course the visuals are the most impressive aspect of the game, especially when taking into consideration the limitations of the hardware. It was all built using an engine that utilised raycasting that many other games on the system took advantage of, and resulted in a truly 3D experience. The environments are fully textured, making all of the levels stand out, may that be Egypt or Rome, which cleverly use different colours to help make subtle differences between the stages, and even though the enemy sprites aren't exactly well detailed from afar, when up close it's easy to make out their different features. Of course all of this comes at a cost, and the game's frame rate is quite low and doesn't lend itself well to the fast gunplay that the series was known for, but getting it all up and running on the handheld was a true technical achievement that once again proved that the GBA could more than hold its own when it came to 3D. F-Zero Climax was one of the 3 games in the series that would see life on the GBA, but would never find its way outside of Japan, and it's a real shame as it's by far one of the most comprehensive entries in the franchise that's absolutely bursting with content and different modes to play. The main draw is the Grand Prix itself, and just like in the previous games you get to choose your class, from novice to standard and expert, as well as the difficulty, that alters the game in many meaningful ways. The higher the class and difficulty, the harder the tracks you'll encounter, and with just over 50 of them included, there's plenty of variety to keep you on your toes. Where Climax excels though has to be the insane amount of unlockables and extras to earn throughout the game, from different characters, vehicles to artwork, and the well thought out track editor that offers a nigh on endless amount of content to not only make your way through, but to create as well. Now in terms of graphics, Climax was a huge step up from Legend, with the rather bland track textures giving way to more detailed and varied designs, and of course each race never misses a beat and delivers the breakneck speed fans will know and love. While the game is essentially a 2D racer, through the use of its Mode 7 style graphical effect, which allows each of the game's tracks to be scaled and rotated to simulate a 3D environment, the game looks absolutely gorgeous in motion, with each of the vehicles and environments possessing a fair amount of detail that's easy to make out as everything whizzes by. Overall, its combination of high speed, skill-based racing, deep customization, and a robust track editor make it one of the finest racing games on the Game Boy Advance. When you think about Tomb Raider, your mind will no doubt go to the PlayStation original or the numerous reboots that followed. However, one of the most astonishing versions of the game is its Game Boy Advance port, often referred to as Open Lara. This ambitious adaptation brings the first adventure to the handheld system that on paper just shouldn't be possible, yet through the incredible engineering and optimization carried out by Xprogger, it manages to capture the spirit of the original while pushing the Game Boy Advance hardware to its absolute limits. Visually, Tomb Raider on the GBA is nothing short of extraordinary. The game retains the blocky, low poly aesthetic of the original with fully polygonal environments and character models. While textures have been simplified and lighting effects reduced, it still looks great in motion. Even more insane is how closely it adheres to the gameplay as well. Fans of classic Tomb Raider will appreciate that the physics and controls feel authentic, allowing for precise jumps and ledge grabs, with the levels themselves remaining mostly intact, though some areas were changed slightly to work around the console's performance constraints. Combat is fully functional, with Lara's trademark auto-aim being in full effect, but due to the limited power, the AI is less advanced, and the animations are far more simplistic when compared to the original. Nonetheless, the presence of wolves, bats, and even humans ensures that the game retains its action-oriented approach, as well as the several puzzles that made it such a unique experience all those years ago. To put it short, Open Lara is a technical marvel, and for fans of the franchise, this version will serve as an impressive curiosity of an adaptation that just shouldn't exist, yet somehow does. The Golden Sun games on the Game Boy Advance were some of the best RPGs that the system ever received, and the second entry, The Lost Age, would set out to offer an even better experience than the first, and despite some shortcomings, it succeeded in doing so. It picks up after the events of the previous journey, and once again focuses on a group of people known as Adepts, who have the ability to channel psychic energy and utilize it in many different ways. As you would expect, this comes in the form of different spells, which are at the center of the game's incredible turn-based battle system, and here you've got the usual options from attack to defend or the use of an item, as well as a certain amount of psychic points that determine how many spells you can use. There's also one more aspect to each battle, and that is Jin. These are elemental spirits that you can encounter throughout the game that can affect your character's class and open up many new ways to take on enemies. Now, much like the original, the visuals are one of the main things that help it stand out when stacked up against one of the many other RPGs that hit the GBA, and whilst you're exploring the world, it's all very familiar, with the game taking on the typical top-down view with a wide variety of locales to visit, each just as impressive and detailed as the last. But when you jump into battle, this is where The Lost Age starts to step it up a gear, and it sees all of them playing out in a pseudo 3D style, complete with polygonal effects for spells and when summoning Jin that give each encounter a really impressive look. Every attack that you carry out comes along with a real weight and goes a long way in helping each of the battles to never become stale or monotonous as a result. Ultimately, The Lost Age is a great follow-up to the original Golden Sun, and is well worth a playthrough for both fans of the series or newcomers looking for a new RPG on the GBA. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for the next one that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos that release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below, to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skilljin, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.